welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today our guest is novelist Matthew Quick, whose story should be an inspiration to all aspiring writers out there. Matt Quick was a tenured English teacher at Haddonfield High School in Haddonfield, New Jersey, when he decided to quit his job in order to devote himself full-time to writing a novel. He finished the novel, which is titled The Silver Linings Playbook, and after dozens and dozens of rejections, finally placed it with one of the best publishers around, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. It has since been optioned for a movie. The book is a great story, but so is the story of Matt's determination to write and get it published. Matt Quick, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you were 30 when you decided to quit your job at Haddonfield High and write your book.
Yes, it was.
What precipitated that decision?
You know, it was just, I loved teaching at Haddonfield, and while I was there, I gave it my all. I would leave maybe 6:30 in the morning, and when I was coaching basketball in the winter, I would often be there till 11:30 at night. And that took its toll after a time. And I'd always wanted to write, and I'd never gotten around to it. And there was this lingering depression that developed. And it just kind of blossomed and blossomed. And one night, my wife sat me down and said, you know, you've got to make a change. You know, you're not happy. You're going into work and putting on a face every day for kids and doing a great job. But when you come home, there's something in here that's not right. And so it's kind of a great story. We're sitting, you know, up one night having a glass of wine, and she said, "What would you do tomorrow? Like, if you could do anything?" And I said, "I would write." And she says, "Well, why don't you write tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, you know, we have a mortgage, we have a house, we have all these things, I have a job." And she said, "What if I can make all that go away?" And so I called her bluff. You know, I said, "Okay, you know, make it go away." And she got on the phone and called her mother and said, "You know, Mom, Matt's always wanted to write. What would you think if we quit our job, sold our house, we'll move up to Massachusetts, and he'll go in the basement for a while and just write?" And to everyone's shock and some people's horror, my mother-in-law said, "Do it, you know, come on up." And so it was very liberating, and, you know, we made this huge move, and we did some traveling for a while first, and, you know, it was very freeing, you know, after 10 years of accumulating stuff in a house to get up and just liquidate.
Boy, the courage involved in doing, I mean, so many people say they want to write a book, if only they had the time to write a book. But it sounds like you had this unusual combination of circumstances. You had a wife that was unusually supportive.
Yes.
A mother-in-law with a basement.
Yes.
And you yourself with, I guess, the confidence to believe that you could do it. Were you frightened?
I was, you know, it was alienating. I wasn't frightened, but when you make that move, you expect certain people to support you that they can't. You know, for example, my parents, you know, the first thing that they thought of was health insurance. How are you going to afford to pay health insurance? What are you going to do with a 4-year gap on your CV? Completely rational questions to anybody who's not a writer. You know, and if you're a writer, you don't think of those things, and the rest of the world does. And so when you make that decision, it becomes very alienating. And before you publish, you're very alone. You know, when you publish, people come back, and this is great, you know, you're not starving anymore, and, you know, so.
But when you say that's, you know, when you're a writer, were you a writer? How did you know you were a writer? At what point did you know? And what had you done before that made you know?
You know, I've always written. You know, even when I was a kid, I was filling notebooks. And, you know, in high school I would write, and my teachers would say, "Oh, you know, you're pretty good, you should pursue this." And there was something that would just light up inside of me when someone would say that. And I always would, you know, force my short stories and poems on, you know, my friends who were usually, you know, just guys who liked to play football and basketball. And they would read them and pretend that they liked them. And I was always that guy, you know. And I think all through LaSalle I wrote, I had college professors that encouraged me. But you get to that point where you're 21 and people stop telling you, follow your dream. They start saying, you know, get a job, get a house, make babies, you know, follow that American dream type thing. And in my English class, I was always telling students, you know, follow your dream, be extraordinary, you know, like this is a great country. And it started to sound hypocritical, you know, because there was this thing that I always wanted to do, but even though I loved teaching, I wasn't pursuing this thing that I always knew that I wanted. I think your original question was, how did you know that you're a writer? There's just something inside of me that wanted to write, and it felt natural, and it was something that I felt that I was good at.
So you didn't have to jumpstart yourself when you got to that point where you were in the basement and you had the time and you didn't have a job, you knew that this was your job, you were able to, because some people find themselves in that situation and then they can't do it. Yeah. It came out, it poured out of you?
It did. It's not easy. I get up every day and I want to go write. We had a house guest come down from Ottawa this weekend. He was here for 4 days. And we have a small apartment, and he's in the house, and my office is what we convert into a second bedroom. So he's in my office for 4 days, which means I can't work. And this is one of my best friends. I love having him around. We went to the Eagles game, we went out to the bars, but the whole weekend, all I wanted to do, on some level, was get back into my office and write. And so I feel most natural when I'm sitting down at the computer writing. And it's not that I don't like to have other experiences, but even when I'm having a good time out, there's always a part of me that wants to go into that room and start clicking away. And I think you either have that or you don't.
I agree with you. I think you know whether you have it or not.
You do, because you're right. You know, and a lot of people say, well, what do I have to do to be a writer? And I say, well, you need to start writing, write for at least an hour every day. Oh, I can't do that. And can you imagine if you said, I want to be a professional baseball player, but I can never find the time to pick up a baseball or a bat? Like, that would be crazy. But for some reason with writers, we accept when people say, I want to be a writer, but I never write. It's kind of a funny thing.
That's right. I can hear you as a teacher talking to your students here.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your book, The Silver Linings Playbook, which deals with a man, Pat Peoples, who has to rebuild himself physically and mentally after a devastating experience in his marriage. It's a very unusual story, written in an unusual voice.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could describe the voice and how you came to it, of Pat Peoples.
I think the voice is very childlike. And, at the risk of throwing out a spoiler, it's almost like Pat gets knocked back 20 years into almost like a teenage, like simplistic mode. And I worked, when I first graduated from LaSalle, I worked at Bancroft Neural Health, and I worked with a lot of people diagnosed with autism, and I worked with a lot of people that were diagnosed with brain trauma. And one of the things that was interesting with working with those populations was that they would often say things without the filter that we have in our minds. So whatever they were thinking, a lot of times they would just say. And sometimes what came out was funny or incredibly honest, almost like they say out of the mouths of babes, like children say these wildly important things because there's no filter. And so with Pat, I really wanted to capture that childlike, simplistic voice that is deadly honest. That he's saying things that on some level are so true that he's not even aware that they are true. And he doesn't understand the wisdom that's coming out of his mouth.
And that's because of the damage
Yes.
that has, the actual brain damage that he suffered.
Yes.
Did you model him on any particular person that you dealt with at the neural facility?
Absolutely not. It's completely fictional. I would say in a lot of ways it's a composite of a lot of people that I've met, and in some ways it's a composite of a lot of the students that I worked with in the high school level too. Teenagers are these wonderfully fragile people that will say crazy things because they haven't learned not to say them yet. And sometimes in all their madness and their hormones and everything else, these beautiful, wonderful, honest things will come out. And so in some ways, I said that Pat gets knocked back into that teenage mode. I really wanted that childlike emotion to come out of him. And I think in many ways that's what I did with Pat.
Well, I think it's interesting, as you're speaking now, I realize that the book, in a sense, is a kind of coming-of-age novel from another perspective, because there is a sense in which he kind of grows up again, or in a different way, in a better way, in the course of the book. And I wonder, you mention a number of classic books in the book, which are obviously books you taught in high school. The Great Gatsby, The Bell Jar, Farewell to Arms, and The Catcher in the Rye. And you deal with them in such a unique way in this book. And one of the points that you make, I think, is that, or that your character makes, is that these books, I guess with the exception of The Catcher in the Rye, are sad, are depressing. Why would you want to have high school students read these books? Your character says.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about using those books and whether you're mimicking some of the points or the statements that were said to you by your students when you assigned them? when
it's funny because it wasn't so much like the students, it was often the parents of my students.
Oh, really?
You know, a lot of times parents in Haddonfield follow along with the curriculum and reread the books or read for the first time. And you know, it's no secret that a lot of high school students deal with depression. And I had a parent once call me and said, every book on your curriculum is depressing. And you know, my son or daughter, I won't identify, you know, can't stand to read these books because they're so depressing. And the phone call really jarred me because for the first time I thought, like, you know what, like these books that we give to teenagers, they really are.
They are depressing.
They're bleak. It's like everything you know, they think is great about America. Well, it's not. You know, American dream doesn't exist. You know, like wealth isn't going to buy you happiness. And all these themes over and over and over again. You know, I started to think about that, you know, American literature, as much as I love it, you know, I'm taught it for 7 years, it is hard to stomach en masse when you're reading these books over, because my students read a book a week, and altogether, you know, it's kind of a bleak outlook. And I'm a believer that, you know, literature doesn't have to be bleak. You know, I love the classics, you know, I read them all, I've taught them, but I think there's room for some hope too.
Which is, your book certainly has hope.
I try to do that, you know, and with my YA book that will be published by Little Brown in 2010.
YA, young adult,
young adult, excuse me, using that business language. But, but again, I tried to underscore that issue of hope.
Although you make a wonderful point, I think, or your character makes the point, that one of the reasons why it's important to read books like this is to feel empathy for people.
Absolutely. You know, and I think it's his therapist, Dr. Cliff Patel, who says that in the book. And that's what I always tried to teach in my classroom. You know, number one, education is usually painful. You know, in order to learn, you've got to suffer. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way, but you know, when you grow up, coming of age is about suffering. It's about learning that there's a lot of pain in life, and
you can't always get what you want.
Exactly, you know, and also that, you know, people's stories matter. You know, and a lot of times, especially in high school, but you know, in adult life too, people go through their lives with a smile on their face. Everything's okay, and I think literature really gives us a great window into what's really going on with people, the things that we don't often say. A lot of people ask me about how to write a good story, and I always tell people, you know, write about what your character would never tell anyone. You know, wouldn't you love to read someone's diary? You know, make the book that person's diary, their intimate, most true, honest feelings, and people will respond to that because there's something inside of us that makes us human, and we relate to that, and we don't often show that humanity to each other, I think, on a daily basis.
One of the extraordinary things about your book is the way you use the eagles.
Oh, thank you.
Really, I don't think I've ever read a book that uses fandom with such, I'm trying to think of the right word, structurally and emotionally, with such nuance.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit, I don't want to spoil the plot.
Sure.
I would like you to talk about how you decided to use eagles, the way in which your character and his family feels about the eagles, and integrate that into the plot in a very essential way. Could you address that?
Sure. You know, growing up, you know, I grew up in a family of bankers, you know, so they're not very expressive, emotional type guys, but one of the things that we always had in common was sports, you know, and you know, there's that old Hemingway line that guys can't spend alone time together unless they're shooting and killing something, but you know, like in my family, you know, a lot of times the only touch you would get from another man was a high five during an Eagles game, or, you know, it's okay to hug your brother at an Eagles game, you know, and so it was this very manly thing to do every Sunday, but on some level it was also a time when you could kind of express your emotions for other men, you know, in a proper way, in a proper setting. And so I had written an essay maybe in my mid-20s about that idea, about how I could relate to my father through football better than probably anything else, and how just bizarre that is, for lack of a better term, and how a lot of men feel this way. And I'd always wanted to do something with that. And when it came time to write the book, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do a kind of an experiment in gonzo journalism, you know, to actually become a part of something and write about it fictitiously, much like